These are stories of outdoor adventure and expert advice from folks with calloused hands. I'm James Nash, and this is the Six Ranch Podcast. Today, we're going to talk about the subject that I think a lot of people encounter, whether they realize it or not. This is probably the episode that nobody asked for, but that a lot of people need to listen to. And I'm here with Dr. Thomas Mather to talk about ticks. How are you, sir?
I'm very well. Is everything going with you?
Yeah, everything's going great here. Tell me a little bit about your background and how you got into ticks.
Yeah, that's... I'll just preface that conversation is when I was a younger boy, I was actually fairly scared of insects and bugs in particular. So finding myself now as the tick guy, I sort of think back and I say, how in the world did I get to that point? But
just like Batman.
Yeah, sort of, I guess. I don't know. I mean, I just remember being horrified if I ever had a American dog tick and my mom would pull it out of my scalp with her, pointy fingernails. And it was, so it's been a journey. I would credit my professor at the University of Delaware, who was a medical entomologist, and he just got me kind of turned on to this whole area of study. And then I went on for my PhD, and I actually started in this area looking at mosquitoes and mosquito-borne virus problems in Wisconsin. And then when I graduated with my PhD, I had opportunities to continue doing mosquito work at some of the competing labs that were competing with us in Wisconsin. Or I had this opportunity to go and study this newfangled thing that they were calling Lyme disease at the Harvard School of Public Health. And since I grew up on the East Coast and my family actually had a family house on Cape Cod, I said, well, maybe I'll go back east. And so I took the position at the Harvard School of Public Health, and it was all about ticks. And because at that point Lyme disease was so new, this was in 1983, almost everything that needed to be known about the ticks that transmit Lyme disease was just there sitting on a platter to pick up and work on. And so it was a very productive time early on, like what ticks were involved in transmitting Lyme disease and where did they pick up the Lyme disease germ and all kinds of things like that, including, and what are we going to do about it, like controlling them or protecting people or something. And even though, there had been people studying ticks for a long time, the black-legged tick that carries the Lyme disease germ wasn't as well known. And it's been sort of on its way coming back since the 70s, the 1970s and everything. And, by the time I got there, it was only, a dozen or so years after they'd really been making more of a play in the New England area. And so there was a lot to do. And, and I've continued to do that. It's kept us busy. There's still a long way to go to help protect people because there's just a lot of misinformation really out there about ticks and Lyme disease and ticks in general, and the fact that, there's just a lot of things that people kind of assume or they think they know, but we have this saying, and actually I wrote a blog that I think everyone knows something about ticks, whether they know it or not, they know something, but it's often just wrong enough to still leave them at risk for getting a disease. And that has sort of been my mode of operation. As I recognize that, then it allows me to say, well, instead of having people be just wrong enough, I want them to be just right enough so that they actually do the right thing to protect themselves and their family and their pets.
Well, that's such a meaningful thing to do because there are seemingly an increasing number of people who are being affected by ticks and tick-borne illnesses. Let's do some myth busting. So one of the most popular myths that I come across is that ticks jump off of brush or jump out of trees and land on you. What do you have to say for that?
Yeah, well, first, fleas have mechanisms for jumping. Ticks don't have mechanisms for jumping. So you have to kind of brush right by them if they're going to get on. But I think what I've learned is that people are horrified. They often will find a tick on their head, and they're horrified to think that a tick latched on at their ankles and crawled all the way across their body to get up to their head. They don't want to think that. So it's much easier to believe that they fell out of the sky from a tree or something like that. But, I don't know one tick biologist that believes that ticks fall out of trees. I spend most of my life in the woods. If I'm not doing it for work, I have it in my backyard. And I have never seen a tick fall out of a tree. I mean, you think about it, they've got tiny little legs. They don't have a lot of extra energy stores until they get that blood meal. So why would they crawl up a tree and across a branch? They don't come fitted. God didn't fit them with wind triangulation tools or anything like that. And they don't have eyes. So just how would they actually be very effective at falling out of trees and actually landing on the host that they desperately need to get a blood meal so that they can either grow or lay eggs, depending on what stage they're in? So you'd imagine, well, they're going to miss a lot of times. And if that was their main strategy for acquiring a host, then they'd be kind of obligated to try and crawl up that tree and across that branch again and again and again until they got it. Well, they'd run out of the ticks that might have done that eons ago have been long lost to natural selection. And so, instead, the smart ticks basically are the ones that crawl up to the exact height that's going to optimize getting on the exact host that they really prefer. And so we see that, let's say, if we just want to focus on any tick. I mean, we were in California, and it was one of the most amazing things I ever saw. We were sort of in a brushland, and if you were on a trail, and you looked down this trail, the grass, the dried grass was sort of light brown on the top and light brown on the bottom. And then there was a curious darkness in the middle, maybe 2.5 feet up. And when you got close to that darkness, and this went on for miles, there were just ticks lined up exactly at that height for about a foot wide strip on both sides of the trail. And not, if you went into the grass off the trail, there weren't ticks there. They were all in that one spot. Why? Because they were hoping to get on probably something the size of a dog that's walking down that trail. And there were billions and billions of ticks for as far as you could see ahead in this dark stripe. So those are the ticks that have succeeded, not the ones that might have crawled up into a tree. There's a lot of things that look a little bit like ticks to people that fall out of trees onto their head, like weevils or aphids or something like that. And that is one thing that I have learned that people help support that misbelief. But the other thing I think is just the thought that, no, I wouldn't have a tick crawl across my body. It would horrify me if it really did. But that's how they get to the top of your head, not falling out of trees.
What's another tick myth that gets under your skin?
Well, people believe that ticks die in the winter because mosquitoes, they feel, die in the winter too, right? After the first frost, the mosquitoes kind of go away, and it must be that way with ticks too because, well, they're both the same ticks. Mosquitoes, they suck blood. They must be similar. But what we have learned is different types of ticks just have different life history strategies. And like American dog ticks, they actually kind of go quiet, the adult stage, in as soon as the day length starts shortening in August and September. You don't see them anymore, so people just assume they must, not be there or dead. They're there. They're not. They just go into a feeding diapause, is what we call it, and they can survive and come out again in the springtime. On the other hand, with black-legged ticks, the ones that are the big transmitters of the Lyme disease germ and many other germs as well, their life history is such that all ticks come in small, medium, and large sizes, the larvae, the nymphs, and then the adults lay eggs. The adult black-legged ticks actually come active in October and November. That's their most prolific time of the year. In fact, after the first frost, you start seeing them more aggressively in New England and the upper Midwest and middle Atlantic states. And that just surprises people because they figure, but it's getting cold. I mean, I go out and do adult tick collecting, and I actually have to carry a hand warmer now because I can be collecting the ticks in 35-degree temperatures, and they're all there, so they're not killed. And so the thing is that when people believe that they would be killed after the first frost, then they stop protecting themselves. In particular, they stop protecting their pets because they don't want to spend the extra money. But those ticks will still be active even in the middle of winter. If we get a 3 or 4 day January thaw or something like that, they're activated again. The reason that it seems like they slow down when it's cold is they're cold-blooded like frogs, right? And so they just can't muster moving their little muscles without some kind of input of some heat. And so, but we did a little thing. We had a little video actually that we did. We buried some ticks. We were having an exceptionally cold snap, and so we buried them under the snow. It was like below zero for overnight. We came out the next day, sort of dug them up out of the snow, and they were all kind of curled up. Put them in my hand. Within 5 seconds, they were walking. So
wow.
Yeah.
Wow.
So that's just another thing, and it changes people's behavior. So what they believe, affects what they do. And so if we could just say, no, they don't die in the winter. You need to keep protecting your pet in November and December. And, if you're and if you live in a slightly warmer area, North Carolina, Georgia, whatever, they don't have winter very much. So these ticks will remain active in the adult stage, even in the winter. So those are a couple of things that, I work very hard to try and correct.
How many species of ticks are there?
Yeah, so there's probably worldwide maybe 800 species of ticks. In North America, we have 3 main culprits. And for your sake out there in Oregon, we'll add 2 more, and so maybe 5 or 6 main culprits. But when we have a sort of a citizen science type crowdsourced tick survey, and we've been doing it for 10 years, and so we've seen a lot of people sending us their pictures of their ticks, and by far and away, about 90% of the submissions are 3 species: black-legged ticks, American dog ticks, and Lone Star ticks. And then there's just an assortment of other types of ticks that get sent in as well. And actually 4 or 5% of the things are things people think are ticks but aren't really ticks, like bed bugs or weevils, or actually the leading thing, curiously, is a household pest called a spider beetle. We get most of our submissions from the Bronx in New York. They think that they've gotten tick, but it's these spider beetles. I don't know. It's just like a household pest, like a carpet beetle or something like that.
Yeah, interesting. And then what are the extra species that we might be encountering here in Oregon?
Yeah, so you have something called wood ticks, which look very much like American dog ticks. Actually, from a picture, I really can't tell. There's a tiny little thing that under a microscope I could tell, but I have had experts tell me that worked in Pullman, Washington, for instance, and they've surveyed ticks, that almost all of the ticks in Oregon, especially off of the coast and inland a little bit more, are populations of wood ticks, not American dog ticks.
Okay.
And then occasionally you'll get, in your neck of the woods at Six Ranch, you'd probably get black-legged ticks occasionally, but they're called Western black-legged ticks out there. And the distinction, you might say, well, they look pretty much the same, but there's a big difference in the risk for disease between those two ticks, because the Western black-legged ticks are less likely to be carrying germs than the black-legged ticks here in the eastern United States.
Can the Western black-legged tick carry Lyme disease?
They do, and about probably 4 or 5% of them are carrying the germ that causes Lyme disease. But in the adult stage, out here in the eastern United States, about 50% are carrying the germ that causes Lyme disease. So it's a big difference in risk.
So I would assume that just because they're carrying the germ and that they bite you does not necessarily mean that you're going to get Lyme. Is that a safe assumption?
Yeah, I mean, I'd say if the tick is attached for over a day, it's had a chance to spit stuff into you for that long. You might have acquired an infectious dose at that point. The sooner that you remove a tick, the less likely it is that you'll get an infectious dose of the germ and get infected. But a lot of times people don't find these ticks right away, and the adult stage will feed for 6 or 7 days. And by then you can see it because they get bigger and bigger and bigger, full of blood and everything. Like on dogs, it's kind of interesting through the tick spotters when you sort of start saying, okay, this is a group of ticks that came from dogs. They're almost all have been attached for 3 to 4 days. And why is that? Because people can find them. They start to get big enough to sort of pop out of the fur a little bit. In the first few days, they're still small, and so people can't really find them through the thick fur.
Can dogs get Lyme?
They do. Yeah. It's interesting. They become infected. So if you do like antibody tests, serological tests, that's what veterinarians will do. You'll have a lot of positives, but you don't, depending on the breed, you don't always get a lot of symptoms. And certain breeds seem to be far more susceptible to showing symptoms when they are infected with the Lyme disease germ, like poodles for some reason and spaniels for another. Those seem to be breeds that are more susceptible to developing lameness or other things that are associated with Lyme disease infections. And then there's some breeds, like we did a study working on some of the early vaccines, and we were just using beagles in the laboratory, and there was not one degree of symptoms, and actually it was actually generated an interesting study. So we can actually let ticks, on pathogen-free ticks, attach to animals, and then they fish out if there's germs there or not. So they would ingest the blood and ingest germs. And we were comparing vaccinated dogs and unvaccinated dogs. And the unvaccinated dogs got infected, and the ticks that we put on them to feed on them actually picked up the germs from the dogs. It sort of revealed that dogs can be a reservoir for Lyme disease too if they're unprotected with a vaccine. But that was the only way we could distinguish between the vaccinated and the unvaccinated dogs. There were no symptoms in beagles, for instance. So it's curious that there's a difference in breeds and their ability to show symptoms.
Of course, yeah. That makes me wonder if there's a difference in the different DNA strains in Homo sapiens as well that would allow folks to feel symptoms more so or less.
Well, it's definitely that, and that part of it is that just everyone's got a slightly different immune status, right? And so some people are very susceptible to certain germs and other people are a little bit more resistant. It depends a little bit on their previous history of exposure to things. It also depends on, their genetics in terms of receptors that these germs use to attach and infect to cells and stuff like that. So, there's a wide variety there, and I think that probably plays out in the differences of people's susceptibility to disease.
Do ticks show a preference for blood type?
I am not sure about that. I haven't really done a study on that. I think I've read things where some people would like to see that association, but I really don't know. It's a good question. I don't know the answer to.
Yeah. Well, let's talk a little bit more about tick ecology and what their life cycle is like, their habitat preferences, their relationship with humidity, things like that.
Yeah, those are all great questions because they differ between the different types of ticks. Some types of ticks, like your wood ticks and American dog ticks, will be in more open, less shady areas, tall grasslands and stuff like that, because they're quite a bit more resistant to desiccating, drying out than, say, black-legged ticks are. They're a little wimpy if you think about that in terms of their ability to survive. They need a higher humidity, and it's a little bit tied into the thickness of we call it the cuticle, basically the outer surface of the ticks. It's just a little bit thicker and a little bit more of a waxy layer on American dog ticks and wood ticks than it is for black-legged ticks, and so they're more resistant to drying out, and so they're able, because of that, they're able to sort of invade more open spaces, maybe near pasture lands and stuff like that, than black-legged ticks would be less likely to be there, because if they did get there, they would be more likely to dry out and die.
So is that a permeability in their exoskeleton?
Yeah, it's a permeability, really. For a tick, they have a couple things that are really important to them. Taking a blood meal, so finding a host so that they can take a blood meal, and not drying out. So they are, if they lose their internal body moisture, then it's curtains for them.
Gotcha. Interesting. Okay, so whenever I'm talking about the life cycle of like aquatic macroinvertebrates, which I talk about with fly fishing all the time, I like to start with the adult phase where they're laying eggs, and then take it back through that cycle again. So, do ticks lay eggs?
They do, and they lay a lot of eggs. So an adult stage tick will take a blood meal. It often, depending on the species, it'll take them 6 to 7 to 10 days of feeding on a host to acquire that blood meal. They gain about 100 times in weight in the blood meal that they take. And something that is curious, I think, is that 60% of blood is water. They don't want the water. They need to have some internal body moisture, but what they do is they actually extract the water from the blood meal and they spit it back out as saliva into you as they're feeding. So you're getting back some of your water.
And Is there a mechanism in that bite that keeps us from being able to detect that they're biting us?
Yes. So that saliva is remarkable in that there are painkillers, there are immune suppressors, there's anticoagulants. So they've been doing this for a long time, and they have optimized their ability to steal blood from a host, because of course if they didn't, then they wouldn't still be here. And hosts, of course, don't like their blood being stolen, so there's been this constant back and forth war that goes on, in terms of, hosts started producing lots of platelets to help clotting and stuff, and ticks figured out, well, okay, the ones that survived and, had something in their saliva that just caused those platelets from doing their job. And so it's been this really interesting sort of evolutionary strategy that hosts and ticks have sort of gone through over the eons. But I think you wanted to sort of hear about the life cycle a little bit. So starting with the adults.
I'm still a little shook up that they gain 100 times their body weight. Like, I'm trying to imagine like myself, eating a meal that causes me to suddenly weigh 2,500 pounds just so that I can reproduce. That is insane.
Yeah.
I don't
but they
like
take
that.
They take that blood and all of the proteins and nutrients in it, and then they use that to sort of mature their eggs. And depending on the species, they can lay anywhere from 1,500 to 5,000 eggs.
Okay.
And they lay them all in one little clump, about the size of a dime.
The size of a dime. Okay,
yeah.
So this is a big clump.
Yeah, it's a big clump. And what happens after that is those eggs mature, and when the little larval stage ticks hatch out, they're all in one spot. And so what happens then, if an unlucky host happens to just go by that spot, they don't just usually get one or two ticks, they get 100 or more ticks.
Yeah.
And so that's another great strategy, from a tick standpoint, because now we've already talked a little bit about how important that saliva is. So if you've got 100 or 300 little larval ticks, they tend to clump in their feeding because I believe they're sharing their saliva so that they all can successfully feed. If just had the one tick with a measly little bit of saliva, the host might be able to, fight back on that. But if it's got this huge dose and all in the size of a sunflower seed or something like that, you got 50 ticks spitting stuff, then it's going to compromise that site so that they can successfully take their blood meal and feed. So then the larvae take usually about 3 or 4 days to engorge, and then they detach from the host, wherever the host happens to be. And some of the ticks seem to have developed clever ways of detaching. Like one of the first pieces of work I did when I went to Harvard was I looked at the sort of when do the ticks detach. And no matter what time of day that I started the ticks on them, they tended to detach in the middle of the afternoon, which would be if they were on a nocturnally active host, that would be when the host was in the burrow or its nest. And what a wonderful place to live through the winter, probably below the frost line, would be in a place where you might find a host, the next time when you're ready to come. And so they've kind of figured out how to. It's really interesting when you start thinking about why do they do these things. Well, there's a reason that I don't think they're thinking about it. It's just the ones that were successful happened to do that, and they continue to do that. It's like
so this life cycle is annual?
Yeah, so the black-legged ticks it takes them 2 years to get through from from egg to larvae to nymphs to adults back to eggs again. It takes 2 years. With the western black-legged ticks in California, sometimes it takes 3 years. And other ticks can get through, a whole a whole life cycle in a couple of months. And so we have one tick called the brown dog tick. Not to be mistaken, American dog ticks and wood ticks are brown too, and they get on your dog. A lot of times people think that, but this brown dog tick it's distributed worldwide, and it lives mostly in like kennels and shelters, and in the south it's a subtropical type of a tick, so it can survive in the north if it's in a kennel or something, and it really thrives on hosts. It can be a household invader as well, so it's a problem for people that take their pet in the winter and go south and then come back north in the after winter is over. And there are we've learned that there are kind of some hot spots for those brown dog ticks in the United States, around San Diego, around Phoenix, around southern Texas, and anywhere from Tampa to Miami and south. And so those are places where a lot of so-called snowbird people with their pets go for several weeks, in the winter, and then they're surprised when they find these ticks in their house, and they're hard to get rid of. It's a nightmare, really. I had a friend who worked on fleas and flea control, and I know a household infestation of fleas is a devastating thing. But he said, Tom, people, they get over that thing, but if they get brown dog ticks, they just want to burn their house down, because it's just it's hard to get rid of. And now the populations of those brown dog ticks are resistant to most of the insecticides that people could use. So it's really a nightmare.
In the canyon country in this area, we have a lot of ticks. And my granddad ran cattle down here in the canyons. And he was one of the early developers of swim-through tanks for cattle as treatment for these bugs. There's actually an old article I found in Popular Science in the 1950s talking about him doing this. Prior to that, he would find cattle that had what local cowboys called tick paralysis, where they would be unable to stand up because they would have all these ticks on them. He carried a quart of 90-weight oil, motor oil, in his saddlebags. And if he found a cow that was down with tick paralysis, he would put a bead of that oil down her back, and the ticks would start popping out of her almost immediately, and she'd be able to stand up and hopefully get to water and survive if she hadn't been out there for too long.
Yeah, it's an interesting story.
Yeah, kind of crazy. One of the craziest diseases that I'm aware of with ticks is alpha-gal. What do you know about that?
Yeah, so alpha-gal, it's a sugar that is in all mammals, and so ticks feed on mammals, and they ingest blood, and in doing that, they also ingest this sugar, alpha-gal sugar. And we've already talked a little bit about the fact that they redistribute their fluids. So they take in this blood, water, alpha-gal. Some of it probably gets processed a little bit, digested maybe, and then it gets spit back out. And so the sugar, maybe in its pure form, but more likely in a slightly altered form, gets spit back out, and it is an allergen then, right? So a person has alpha-gal sugar, they then get this alpha-gal syndrome. So, you don't get it, but the tick is spitting something that's a little like what you have, but not quite like it, and then it causes an allergy to what you have. And that is, I think, my best description of what I think is going on. Not everybody gets it after being exposed to ticks, and in particular, they have found so far, scientists have found that it seems to be most associated with one type of tick called the Lone Star tick. Now, the good news for you all is that you don't have very many Lone Star ticks. We get very few reports from your West Coast area. I think that they just haven't gotten established there yet, but they kind of stop in Kansas and Nebraska, and I think people that travel might bring individual ticks there. But when you look at the preponderance of Lone Star tick distributions, it's in the eastern and southern United States. And when you look at the occurrence of alpha-gal syndrome, this positivity to a sugar, an antibody to a sugar, and in some cases people with sort of an allergic reaction that can vary from just mild gastric distress to anaphylaxis. Again, that probably is because of the diversity of people's genetic backgrounds and everything. Yeah. But it's been recognized for probably, 15 years now, and seems to be growing. And where its greatest growth is in new places where these Lone Star ticks are invading. So right now where I'm sitting in Rhode Island, we're right at the sort of the leading edge of the northward infestations of Lone Star ticks. And so it's something that we're actually quite familiar with and aware of. And what we realize is that people don't know what the risk is, their personal risk is, of getting a red meat allergy if they eat red meat and getting this alpha-gal syndrome. They don't know what the risk is. So they see every tick as possibly something that's going to give them a red meat allergy. They're worried about that. But two things: not every tick seems to be associated with it, so they need to know how to identify their ticks. And secondly, not everybody seems to get, severe symptoms or symptoms at all. For instance, I've been bitten by many, many Lone Star ticks, and I still happily can consume red meat without a problem.
But that's good news.
Yeah, right.
A dear friend of mine got it in Oklahoma. He's a doctor. He's a veterinarian. And the way it has presented for him is he's no longer able to eat any mammal protein meat at all. Like, he can't eat any mammal meat. He also can't have dairy now. So if it's a product that comes from a mammal, he can't have it. It makes him feel like he drank burning gasoline.
Wow.
And in his last test, the doctor told him, maybe in a couple years you can try pork. And while that's like personally terrifying as a lover of red meat, I think it's also fascinating from an evolutionary standpoint. So if you have a tick that can do this to a predator species, and now that predator can continue to survive, but it can't consume any other mammals, that makes for more food possibilities for that tick, which is incredibly clever.
Yeah, if that really is, James, that's a really interesting speculation. I don't know if it trickles down. I don't know that we know that, because there's been millions of dogs that have been bitten by Lone Star ticks, and yet we don't really see that as a veterinary concern at this point. So it could be unique to humans. I'm not really sure. It's an interesting hypothesis, though.
Well, I think that's about as far as my science ever goes these days. I get to the
speculation.
Hypothesis stage, punt it out into the bleachers, and then move on to the next thing.
Right.
Because
and with all of your followers, that's where all of my misinformation that I have to combat comes from. Then too.
That's right. But they're my fact checkers. If I get something even slightly wrong, or write in a way that's uncomfortable, I'm going to hear about it from thousands of people. So it's an interesting vetting process, this social media thing we got going on.
Yeah.
So, okay, now I would love to talk about prevention. There are a lot of different ways that people do try to prevent getting bit by ticks. I think that some of them are more effective than others. There's a lot of fear around some of the chemical treatments like permethrin. I would love to hear about what you believe is the most successful ways that people can be preventing getting bitten by ticks for themselves, for their pets, for livestock, and what times of year they should be concerned about it.
Yeah, so again, the time of year, we can just start with that, depends on the tick species, right? So we've already talked a little bit about the different types of ticks have different seasons of activity and in different stages. For instance, your wood ticks out where you live now, they start to become active even in February. And
we saw one last week.
Getting on livestock and stuff, and they will continue to increase in their abundance through early summer, and then I think they sort of start to drop off in terms of people finding them necessarily into the late summer and definitely in the fall. They're a little bit sensitive to that sort of diurnal day length kind of a thing, and so they just sort of have decided they're not going to make it to get another blood meal, so they just wait it out until the next year. I think it's really important for people one of the most important things is that everyone should know the types of ticks that they have where they live and when they're active. And so, for instance, with black-legged ticks, they come in larvae, nymphs, and adults. The nymphs get on people at their shoe level for the most part, and they become active in late April, early May, June, July. So those would be the months that you would really want to have protection at that shoe level to start with. And then when the adults come out in October and November, they rarely are at shoe level. They're mostly up at knee level because they want to get on a larger host, right? So they've adapted to getting on a larger host, so they crawl up the vegetation a little bit. Treating your shoes would be less effective at protecting yourself. So knowing the types of ticks and when they're active is really, that's like job one. You should just know that. And we try to use our social media postings to let people know in different parts of the country, like just, what tick they need to be thinking about now, and then they can make better decisions about the types of things that they could do to protect themselves.
And something you have available is actually a Google Calendar, which will tell people what they need to be concerned about at different times of year. So I added that to my Google Calendar, and maybe 3 or 4 or 5 times a month, there's something there that I can click on, and it'll tell me what's going on at that time of year so that I can be aware and precautious of it.
Definitely. A lot of times we believe that, I know you mentioned permethrin, but we believe permethrin on clothing and shoes is probably the number one most effective way to prevent, for personal protection. In addition to that, most people don't really like tucking their pants into their socks. They think it either looks stupid or it's uncomfortable. But that helps keep ticks from crawling up the inside of your pants, and then you find them a day or two later, in places that you wish they didn't get. And tucking in your shirt. I'm guilty of that too. I don't like necessarily tucking in my shirt, but I definitely, when I'm out in the woods, either doing yard work or collecting ticks, I tuck my shirt into my waist, again, to keep the ticks on the outside of my clothing more. Now, for us, when we're collecting ticks, we don't want to use permethrin because we want the ticks to be alive, and it's a very, very effective not just a repellent, it repels ticks, and without much trouble, they end up dying, as well. And we've done many studies. We've done a large study with outdoor workers, and we showed that there's no greater risk or exposure to, permethrin penetrating your skin than permethrin is a widely used insecticide anyway, and it's a lot of places. And so there was no difference in the people that were wearing treated clothes and the people that were wearing untreated clothes in terms of the amount of permethrin metabolites in their urine, for instance.
Okay, that's great news.
So if you apply it correctly, let it dry on your clothing, then it seems to be a very, very effective and safe way of having a repellent, wearing it in your clothing. But you need to think about it, in time before you're going to be exposed, so that you can let it dry. So you don't want it to be in, more liquidy form. But once it's dry on the clothing, cats are known to be very sensitive to permethrin, but they can sit on your lap if your pants are treated and without any problem. If you had just sprayed it and they lick it, then that's a different story.
Okay.
But
so is it the type of deal where you want to spray down your lower pant legs like the night before you're going to go out?
Yeah, and if you do that, it lasts for probably through 3 to 5 washes.
Okay, so lasts a long time.
For me, I have my clothes treated once a year. They can, there's a company called Insect Shield in North Carolina that does this. They you can get an envelope full of clothing and send it to them, and they'll treat it for you. And depending on how often you wash it, in our one study we had, so we only were treating people's work clothes, the clothes like their uniform clothes, and they also probably were exposed to ticks at other times, but we showed that there was a 65 or so percent difference between people that were wearing treated uniforms versus untreated uniforms in terms of tick bites. And it lasted through the year. When they had the same clothes the next year, the effectiveness dropped down to in the 50% range. So that just shows that it wears off after a little while. And so my own practice is to just retreat my clothes, once a year and not wash them very often. So like my work clothes, some people would wash their clothes all the time, and then they're going to have to replenish the permethrin treatment again. But for me, I can go and wear the same pair of shorts in the summer for mowing my lawn for a month and wash them then. And so it's like, all right, so I can get through the whole summer usually and still be protected. But most people will not think about this one little trick. If they're spraying it themselves, they buy a can of spray and they'll spray the outside. But the ticks are on, they're crawling up on the inside. So if you didn't turn up the lower foot or so of clothing, then the ticks will get underneath there, and then they might not feel the treatment that you've sprayed on the outside. So if you have it professionally treated, they do it like in a washing machine type of a thing, so it gets the inside and the outside both treated.
Yeah, that's a hot tip. I like that a lot. I've
but
seen
the shoes. The shoes are the interesting thing, and so we often start there because, just like you mentioned, people are a little leery about it, but it turns out it seems like people are very much willing to treat their shoes. I guess they figure they're walking through poo and all kinds of other stuff, so their shoes are dirty anyway or whatever. So getting them started with the shoe treatment and against the nymphs. So everyone should, that lives where black-legged ticks do that come out in April, have your shoes treated April, May, June, July. And it turns out that unless you're like going through streams in them or something, it lasts for about a month. So we gave treated shoes to some teenagers. That would be pretty rough on them, you would think. And it turned out, and then we took them back after a month and put ticks on them, and the ticks were killed. So it lasts at least a month. So one of the ways we like to package protection, if you have a pet and you're giving it a monthly treatment, just do your shoes the same day, and then the family has some level of protection, and you get started. And after a while you say, well, that seems to have helped, but what about, could I do more, right? And so once you haven't, your leg hasn't fallen off because of the permethrin treatment, then you'd say, oh, okay, I can do more. This actually seems good. And so just trying to build up people's trust and confidence in protection, I think, is sort of one of the approaches that we try to take.
I've seen some hunters wrap duct tape around their legs with the sticky side out. What are your thoughts there?
Yeah, it could help. I've seen people do that too, and it just seems like it's so much easier to just have treated clothing.
Yeah, that makes sense to me.
I mean, for pretty much the same price, you can get a can of spray for $10 and a roll of duct tape for $8, and it's like then you've got all that wasted duct tape that you're throwing off each time. I mean, I don't know. Something that takes more effort, I tend not to do. I think it has to be a pretty motivated person to put the duct tape thing on. And
it can be visually a little bit appealing, I guess, or not, to see all the ticks that get stuck to it. But what should people be doing for their pets? What should they be doing for their bird dogs?
Yeah, so there are some great products. They just they work in two different ways. So there's the tick control products like a Seresto collar or something like that kills ticks that are loose and wandering. And then there are other products like NexGard or Simparica or some of these chew tablets that are convenient, but the tick has to bite the dog first in order to get a dose. So you just have to be aware of those two mechanisms. Like from a family protection standpoint, we would like to get people to use a product that kills ticks on contact rather than letting them wander around on the fur of the pet and maybe transfer to someone in the household that lets the pet sit in their lap or something like that. But on the other hand, just protecting when the ticks are active, and in the case of black-legged ticks, it needs to be all year long, just because they could be active in the winter on a warm day too. So whatever works, we just want people to use the protection.
Gotcha. Okay, so say I get a tick on me. I want to know what kind of tick it is. I don't know. How can I figure it out?
Yeah, so that has been something that we really recognized, and we developed a simple to use online survey tool called Tick Spotters. You can take a clear picture of the top side. So I have to specify that. You would, even though the instructions say how to do it, people don't look at instructions and we get all kinds of things, bottom side up. And I will have to tell them then when they send me the picture, I said, well, I think it's this, but I'd be really more certain if I could see the top side of the tick, because most of the unique characters of ticks are found on the top side, not the bottom side. But if you, instead of freaking out, if you have a purpose, you say, oh, well, if I want to know what kind of tick it is, I got to save it and take a picture of it. And almost everyone's carrying a suitable picture-taking device with them these days. So just take a picture of it and then find Tick Spotters and submit their picture and a little bit of information. Like, it's really important to us to know, where they probably encountered it. So for instance, like if you in your zip code sent me a tick, I'd have to know the zip code to sort of sort out whether it was a Western black-legged tick or an Eastern black-legged tick. I can't really, they look, under a microscope I could figure it out, but not from a half blurry picture. So, but this is a way we get back to people within 24 hours, have done that for 10 years. And it really helps people then make their next best decision of what to do next, whether they want to, if it seems like it's a risky tick, they might want to have it tested. If it's not such a risky tick, they might choose not to have it tested, for instance. One of the things that really is clear is everyone's concerned. At first, they were concerned that every tick's going to give them Lyme disease, but we have shown clearly, in not just me, but lots of people that test ticks, that other types of ticks don't carry the Lyme disease germ. So just knowing what kind of tick it is, you might know what likely you were exposed to and what the risk is. And you can make better decisions about what to do next, or what symptoms to look for, or whatever. So the Tick Spotters program, I think, is really, really useful in that regard, giving people sort of they get a chance to hear from a tick expert. Not everybody has a tick expert, but it opens that door.
Yeah. Okay. So take a picture, Google Tick Spotter, and take it from there. And let's say people at this stage are like finally understanding that they did not know enough about ticks and they want to learn more. The stuff that you've written and that you have available on tickencounter.org is so accessible. It's really easy to read. I think a grade schooler could read that and understand it. And I love that. So many people will make things more complicated than they need to be, and it's off-putting. So that's another resource that I would highly recommend is tickencounter.org. Folks, you're going to be able to find links to these guys' social media, to TickSpotter, to Tick Encounter. All that is down here in the podcast description. You can just click on it and go straight there. What is your parting piece of advice to people, Dr. Mather?
Well, one parting piece of advice is don't freak out if you find a tick. Now take a picture of it, send it to Tick Spotters, maybe put it in a Ziploc bag. I think that's why they created Ziploc bags for people to store ticks in. And, give it a day after sending it to Tick Spotters, and you'll know better what to do next, because the report that we give you will tell you what type of tick it is, what its likely chance of being infected is, and next best steps will remind people that maybe next time they would want to either, if it was on their dog, maybe they need to protect their dog, or if it was on their kid, maybe the kid should be wearing permethrin treated shoes or socks or pants or something like that. So it's a good entree point to get some personalized, tailored information based on what you're finding where you live.
From everything that I'm hearing, this feels like very much a public health issue, and I would like to see some programs making permethrin available to the public at public health places. You should be able to go to a medical clinic and get permethrin, because it sounds like that's the best preventative that we could possibly be using.
Yeah, the one nice thing about Amazon is that you can easily get it there, and they bring it right to you. Then I don't know how many people say, "Oh yeah, I got that stuff," and I'm like, "Well, then I'm surprised you got a tick bite." And you say, "Oh, I haven't sprayed it or used it." It's like I had one sweet old lady from Arkansas once describe to me. She was like in her 80s, and she had submitted two ticks, and I started, trying to help her with that. And then I found out, she said, oh, I have one of those permethrin treated shirts, and I have those permethrin treated pants, and I have permethrin treated socks. And I said, ma'am, I'm really kind of perplexed then how you got those tick bites. And she said, oh, I wasn't wearing them.
Yeah.
And I'm like, why?
Yeah.
And she said, I'm saving them for when I go on a big hike in the woods sometime. And I'm thinking to myself, you're 80-something years old. It'd be time to wear them because, your eyesight starts to fail. You can't really see the ticks very well. It really, just protect yourself is sort of my parting word, I guess.
Yeah.
There are tools to do it. And now we just need people to use the tools to do it.
Well, Doc, thank you so much for your many, many years of help and helping people learn more and prevent these diseases, because stuff like Lyme, alpha-gal, some of these other tick vector diseases, they're terrible, and they ruin people's lives. It is preventable, but you've made it clear that there's some simple steps that people can take to prevent these things from happening to them, and how and why they should be doing that. I can't thank you enough for that and for your time here today.
Yeah, well, thanks for having me on and giving me the opportunity to share what I've learned with others.
Yeah, my pleasure, sir. Thanks again, and bye, everybody. Stay safe out there, and